Unsure about what you need to know for the GED Social Studies test? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you a GED Social Studies topic overview. Hi, this is Parker from Test Prep Champions teaching you how to pass the GED fast, and you can get started by clicking subscribe down below. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you the topics that you're most likely to get on the GED Social Studies test. But before I go any further, please note that this is not an exhaustive list. And what I mean by that is that there are other topics that may come up on the GED Social Studies test that I won't be talking about here in this video. Also note that nobody can predict with 100% certainty exactly which topics that you're going to get. So you might get many of these topics, you might only get a few of them, or you might even get none of them. However, these are the topics that you're most likely to see on the GED Social Studies test. So also note that if you're taking notes and if you want to make yourself a checklist here, which I encourage you to do, you can pause the video at any time because I'm going to be talking here at a speed that might be a little fast if you're trying to copy everything that I say. So feel free to watch this video multiple times, pause the video, rewind at any time, do whatever you have to do here. And again, these are the topics that you're most likely to see on GED Social Studies. So you might be wondering, do I have to memorize things like dates, names, and places? And note that GED Social Studies is not a memorization test. However, that being said, the more that you know about each topic, the better off you're going to be. And you can learn more about these topics on my channel here. I'll be filming videos on many of these topics. Some I already have done right now. You can also use your textbooks, like if you've got a Kaplan, Princeton Review, or other textbook. And also you can use other YouTube channels. A good one is Crash Course. But there are many YouTube channels to learn this stuff. And of course, you can always Google the topics. But if you Google them, just be careful. Make sure that you're reading on good, reputable sources so you're not getting misinformation. Okay. So, U.S. history is a big topic on GED Social Studies, and many of the questions will ask you things like who, what, why, where, and when. So in many cases on the GED Social Studies test, you'll be given a passage to read, for example, and the passage then after you're done, you might get some questions that ask you who were these people, what happened, why was this significant, where did this take place, and when did it happen. So as you're reading on your own and studying to prepare for the test, always think about who, what, why, where, and when. And also, as you're reading passages, when you get in there to take your test, just remember these W's. So, for example, let's think about the Pilgrims. So you might get a passage about the Pilgrims, and some things to think about would be who were they, what role did they play in history, why did they come to America, where were they from, where did they arrive, and have a general idea of when this stuff took place. Okay, so let's now talk about some of the topics in U.S. history that you're most likely to see. So one would be exploration and colonization, and this would be things like the explorers from Europe who came to America and settled here. All right, also a big topic is the American Revolutionary War and wars in general. So for wars in general, here are some things that you should know about, mainly about American wars. So for all wars, you really want to have an idea of who were the major players, meaning which countries were involved. You don't have to know every single country and which side they fought on, but you should know the main countries, the biggest players, and you want to know which sides they were on. You also want to know the winners and losers in some of the major causes for the wars and have a general idea about when they happened. So I'm talking about things like the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I and World War II, and the Vietnam War, but those are the most important ones to have a general idea about, things like who the major players were, etc., etc. And so, for example, for the American Revolutionary War, it was the 13 colonies, or the Americans fighting against Great Britain, and you would want to know that France sided with the Americans. You also want to know that the American colonists won and Britain lost. And there are numerous causes, but basically the colonists wanted freedom from Great Britain. They were tired of paying taxes. And again, for the when, you don't need to necessarily memorize dates, but you should roughly know that the American Revolution was fought in the 1700s, near the end of the 1700s. All right, so that's just an example of some things that you should know. All right, so another topic in U.S. history that's important and comes up a lot on the GED test would be westward expansion. So the U.S. didn't always have 50 states, and westward expansion was when the Western territories were added to the U.S. as settlers traveled out west. And there's a really good song. It's a schoolhouse rock song. It's really good to help you understand U.S. history and westward expansion. It's called Elbow Room. It's a schoolhouse rock song, so I'll put a link to that down below as well. And so you also want to know about the Civil War, so you'd want to know things like a general idea of when it was fought. You should know that it was fought in the 1800s. Who were the different sides? You should know that it was the North versus the South, or in other words, the Union versus Confederacy. And I'm not going to teach you all the U.S. history here in this video, but my point here is that I want you to have a general idea about some of these topics. So if you're making a list or a checklist of these topics, okay, make sure that you understand for the wars, have a general idea, again, of who the major players were and the winners and losers, some of the causes, and have an idea of when, and you should be okay. So moving on here, you also want to know about industrialization in the 1800s. So there was a boom in factories, mostly in major cities like New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Also note that there was a boom in immigration to the U.S. as immigrants were drawn to factory jobs. So that's what I mean by industrialization in the 1800s. And also World War I and World War II are big topics, as I said. And so again, for war questions, all right, you're going to be at an advantage if you go into the test and you already know some things like who were the different sides in World War I, what were some of the causes, have an idea of when World War I took place, and who were some of the winners, who won and who lost. You should know that for World War I and World War II going into your test if you really want to maximize your score. Also, the Great Depression is a common topic that does come up on U.S. history questions in the GED Social Studies test. Also, the Cold War, which was a power struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So another important topic is the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. And now moving on to government. So the most of your questions will come from U.S. history or from government. And as I said before, okay, I want to keep reminding you of this because it is important to drive this point home, that this isn't a memorization test. You don't have to go out and know every single thing under the sun about the Great Depression or about World War I. But you should, if you want to really maximize your score and make life easier, okay, the more that you know about these topics, if you have a general idea of what I'm talking about when I say the Civil Rights Movement, okay, or the Great Depression, just taking some time to Google that topic and just find a good source or two, just do a little bit of reading about it or watch a YouTube video or two about it on my channel or somewhere else. All right, everything that you can do to know some of this information ahead of going into your test, okay, it's going to give you an advantage. It's going to make life easier. And this is a big topic here that I would recommend checking out ahead of time because it can be confusing, right? So the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights is a big topic. Also, the Declaration of Independence and U.S. government, right? So you want to know about things like branches of government, okay, Senate, the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, and what I mean by checks and balances. And I do have videos where I talk about this, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and I do touch on the branches of government in those videos. Okay, so also it's good to know about elections. So elections do come up on the GED test. So things like political parties or electoral college and how the electoral college works, you might get passages about these topics on your test. So you also might get some basic economics questions. And so this stuff, it's not, I would prioritize in your studying if you're pressed for time. I'd prioritize the U.S. history and knowing a little bit about those government topics, like what I mean by the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. If you're really pressed for time, I would review some of that stuff before I look too much into the basic economics. But if you really want to maximize your score and just blow the test away, then you do want to know some basic economics concepts. Like, what do I mean by supply and demand? Okay, you want to know markets and recessions and depressions. Also banking stuff like basic banking, stock market, interest rates. And again, you don't have to go and know everything about banking or know everything about the stock market or interest rates. Okay, you're not going to have to memorize stuff about these topics because if you get economics questions on your test, you're going to be given a passage. So you'll have that passage to read, or you might have charts or data to look at, and then you'll be answering questions based off of that stuff. Okay, so my point here though is that if you understand a little bit about the stock market and interest rates or banking before you go into that test, okay, you're not going to be seeing it for the first time on that test, because what throws a lot of students off is when they get a passage that's about supply and demand and they have to sit there and they're trying to figure out from the passage what it means and they're confused and they're stuck. Now, if you had knowing a little bit about supply and demand ahead of time, it's going to make it a lot easier when you get that passage on the test. So again, it bears repeating. It's just so important that you don't have to memorize every single little thing about all these topics. And if you're really pressed for time, you don't necessarily have to study all these topics, but just expect that questions on these topics are likely to arise on your test, and whatever you can do to know a little bit about this stuff ahead of time, it's going to give you an advantage. So another topic would be labor and consumer issues, so collective bargaining, which it's basically negotiation of wages and other conditions of employment by a group of employees. So collective, that's another word for group. So basically group bargaining and strikes. So also conservation of resources, so things like renewable versus non-renewable resources. So it's actually fairly common to get questions to get a passage in a reading that talks about endangered species or renewable and non-renewable resources, to read a passage about this stuff and have to answer questions. So these kinds of questions do come up fairly often on the test. All right, and so these are just some topics here to get you started on your GED Social Studies studying. So if you have any weak areas, I would definitely look into those weak areas first, and you'll want to check my next video out on the series where I talk about the different types of questions that may come up on GED Social Studies. So the questions will largely be about these topics. Like I said, there might be other topics, but what kind of questions, what specific types of questions can you expect to get? That's what I'm going to make in my next video. So make sure you're subscribed down below for that, and once it's up, I'm going to be adding it right here under the end screen. So if it's out now, go ahead and click it and watch it next.